Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 664th New Social Environment. My name is Raven, and I'm the Special Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Shezad Dawood and Charlotte Kent, and we're thrilled to welcome poet Ty Liddell here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded lands and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Working across the disciplines of painting, film, neon, sculpture, performance, virtual reality, and other digital media, Shezad Dawood asks key questions of narrative, history, and embodiment. Using the editing process to explore both meaning and forms, his practice often involves collaboration and knowledge exchange, mapping across multiple audiences and communities. And our host, Assistant Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Charlotte Kent, has a particular interest in historical frameworks of art practices, with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and various academic journals, and she is an editor at large at the Brooklyn Rail. And now to pass it over to you, Charlotte.
Hooray! It is a pleasure to be here with everyone today. And Shezad, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for the intro, Raven, and nice to be here.
I want to launch straight in because I am actually quite excited about this HMS Alice Liddell. And so I'm wondering if we could get an image. I think it would be, I think I'd just love to know about how this project came to be. I know it's been 3 years in the making. There's so many things to start with, but at least initially, people can see here it is. It's at St. Pancras Station, so people get to walk through. It's like a public artwork. It's also got sound associated with it. It's got an AR component. But to start with, why this airship?
It's difficult to know where to start. I mean, generally, I kind of approach a project from a number of vectors at the same time. And I guess it sort of fits with this sort of time travel object. Maybe just in terms of, one of the things I'm really interested in is this line between the embodied and the disembodied, and like how you allow a number of voices or even ghosts into a project. And I was really interested, I was invited to propose a project for St. Pancras Station. And, after a long drawn out process of shortlisting, actually won the commission. And, when asked, I was not required to come up with something that was necessarily that site responsive. They just wanted an artwork. And, I almost don't like that. I like to be site responsive. I like to think about histories. Interestingly, I grew up in London, not far from St. Pancras Station. For those who know Listen Gallery in London, I grew up not far from there in quite a urban, very culturally diverse neighborhood. I grew up with friends who were, Armenian, Indian, African, Caribbean. It was very much part of my sort of birth into the world. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to one of the sad things about this work is that my grandmother wasn't still alive to see it, because she kind of really raised me and was deeply concerned when I wanted to be an artist. There's something about this, I should just admit it, that I was sitting there when this literally was being elevated off the ground into position. And one of the things I really was interested in was how you move from public sculpture, which is such a sort of static or concrete sort of mode, and do something that kind of explored potential movement or kinetics. And that kind of runs across my painting as much as VR or sculpture. I'm always thinking about almost like an unintentional choreography of place. and how people move around it, how work kind of might be still but imply movement. And I was really interested. I was just like, what do I do? I love the neo-Gothic of, you know, St. Pancras. Basically, the original St. Pancras Hotel is this sort of neo-Gothic kind of masterpiece. But, you know, the neo-Gothic also for me evokes Venice as something that shouldn't be. You know what I mean? It's that sort of Baroque tendency to kind of enact the absurd or the fantastical. And that for me connected to Alice's Adventures Underground. The original manuscript is next door in the British Library. And then I was also interested, you know, I'm always interested in multidimensionality. So, you know, Alice, I wanted to name it after Alice Liddell because I feel like she often gets really overshadowed by the fictional creation. The fictional Alice. And she was quite an amazing lady in her own right. I mean, supposedly she was pursued by Queen Victoria's youngest son. She went on to be the first president of the Emery Downs Women's Institute. And, you know, if you think about the time when she lived, that's, you know, she was kind of a relatively radical lady and lived her life her own way. And then I got, you know, I like to jump around. So I got thinking about steampunk as a genre, you know, which is, I like sometimes bringing trashy subcultures into play, and that's sort of where high and low meet. And, you know, thinking about travel, about possibility, that idea of bringing the past and the future into collision with each other.
Which is sort of the present tense after all.
Exactly. You know, and I always see the present tense as an unfixed kind of time. You know what I mean? It's permanently in evolution and up for grabs. And I think what's really interesting about, you know, Alice in Wonderland, or Alice's Adventures Underground, as its original title was, is it's, you know, for me, it's like one of the earliest masterpieces of speculative or science fiction. And I think, like the best speculative fiction, it's up for grabs. It can be reinvented for every time, for multiple communities, multiple stakeholders. And even my use of a sort of polychrome paint finish is to sort of almost how something moves from the past into kind of a cosmopolitan London of today.
Well, actually, since you just mentioned the polychrome finish, it was something I wanted to ask you about, because it seems so fitting. And when you look at this picture, or maybe even the next picture, I think there's a close up and you can kind of see the sheen a little bit. Well, you get a sense of the sort of texture of the color and so forth. How did you, I mean, did you always know it needed to be polychrome finish? Did you stumble on that? It seems so suited, and yet it's also almost like a miracle thing to have thought of.
I mean, interestingly, the polychrome is something I developed already nearly a decade ago, and I've been using it consistently in different sculptural work. And it was something I was really interested in, how you translate a virtual object into the material plane, you know, almost philosophically, where something, because I think I get a lot of questions about, virtuality, but I think virtuality has always been with us. Absolutely. You know, if we think about even from Neolithic times, and kind of, I'm quite interested in the paleo cinema theory, where, you know, actually cave paintings are not paintings, they're animations that were meant to be animated through firelight. And I think that tendency to movement is always there for me. You know, like the best paintings are not the ones that kind of are static or kind of stuck in their genres or their times, but ones that continue to dance in our imaginations.
And Caravaggio has this, there's so many people who say the same thing about Caravaggio, in the sense that if you were actually to be in those churches by candlelight, it does a very, very different effect as well, right? So there's sort of sense in the way art and painting almost seeks to be in motion, whether through its own effect or through our imaginations. Absolutely.
And, you know, the polychrome is designed to kind of totally alter according to the ambient light conditions. So one of the sort of small miracles, and, you know, in a way it's fresh in my mind because we just installed this like a week ago. And, you know, it's, you know, St. Pancras is a hugely busy station. I think, you know, before COVID, it gets 52 million people passing through it a year, you know, which I also love. I mean, there's something wonderful about breaking out of the institution and into that very public thoroughfare where people can ignore your work or be surprised by it in equal measure. And we were there, basically the install window is between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. and we have one night to get it right. So it's pretty high risk. And obviously this thing starts floating at 4 a.m. And soon after dawn breaks and a totally different, patina erupts. There was almost a kind of orange gaslight, which reminded me of the sort of Victorian kind of, or even William Blake, and this orange glow literally lit up the top surface and it turned emerald green like it was out of the Wizard of Oz. And it's, for me, I think it's magic shared is magic earned.
I love that magic shared is magic earned. One of the things that struck me about this was, there's much to say about virtuality, but before we go there, this way in which I want to have this be a ship, right? Like I'm thinking of this as a ship, and then it's floating in the air, and then it's got these buildings on it that are going in multiple directions, right? So I can't actually be clearly positioned in terms of which right side up sort of dynamics, which of course is so much a part of what speculative fiction often tries to cultivate in us, right? Is that sort of like turning things topsy-turvy, making things be a little different. I mean, Alice in Wonderland explicitly states that, right? But I guess the question I sort of had is like, why do you think in the context of sort of this particular project, that was such an appealing maybe object to create? Like, I know it's more than it, but like just to stick to this one thing before we get to the AR component, like this one object, like how is this the object to express all of that sort of potential mobility in time and space and direction?
I think I was interested in producing an object that was barely real. Do you know what I mean? It's sitting there hovering above your head as if it's, and literally I should sort of admit that I do a lot of my sculpting now in ZBrush. And one of the things that kind of connected for me to the polychrome was, you think of early gen ZBrush, it uses sort of polychrome masks to give the illusion of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional computer screen. So for me, there became something really interesting about trying to literally pull an object out of the screen, almost as if you're, moving it with your mind from virtual space and it's temporarily embodied. And I sometimes think, isn't that the whole of being? I'm very interested in a lot of kind of Buddhism and other esoteric philosophy. And so there's this interest for me in there's the very basic question of what is real, how real are we? And then, for me, that becomes interesting in terms of art making, because if we're barely real, what becomes of the things we put out there? Whether it's a piece of writing, a piece of poetry, a film, a score, it's all a sort of projection of mind into the kind of collective field of being. Yeah. And that, not to go too deep on it, but that's a lot of what motivates me to get up in the morning.
Totally. I mean, I think I'm actually thrilled to hear that, because I feel like these are some of the places I was hoping we would get to. Because there's so much around technology that seems like the word virtual has been applied to it, we forget this older use of virtual to mean possible, right? To mean there's any number of philosophies that will articulate the way in which we're the virtual of some actual real that supersedes us in some way. And I think, this is this huge struggle we're having right now. And this is why I was sort of interested in this like spaceship, watership sort of thing that you've created, because, Alice in Wonderland is underground, even per the original title. At this early moment, we also had 80,000 Leagues Under the Sea back then, right? There's this sort of interest in going underwater, right? And going deep into the earth. And then over the last century, it's become increasingly this thing of going up into the air and into space. And there's this way in which I was looking at this and I was thinking, right, you've managed to kind of remind us that between the underwater and the space, there's just actually where we are and the degree to which we don't know where we are. And so, especially in the context of this kind of cyber, this steampunk and this kind of, invocation of speculative realities, I'm going to go to a post-human thing, if I may, for a moment, and say, there's this idea that for us to really be able to conceive of the post-human, we need to be able to change the way we think itself, right? Because the way we think has been ingrained by a certain set of language terms and beliefs and histories. And if we're going to be able to think beyond the limitations of ourselves, we need to change the way we think. And Carrie Wolf has talked about this. And so I guess, I wanted to ask if these kinds of speculative works that you do are a part of playing with that for you.
Absolutely. I mean, while you were talking, I was sort of thinking of, one of my favorite books is the transcriptions of the lectures or conversations between David Bohm, the physicist, and Krishnamurti, the sort of spiritual teacher, and their sort of explorations in consciousness. And, for me, there's something really fascinating in taking, whether it's Buddhist or Vedic ideas, for example, the Vedic concept of shunya, that which is ancient, is that there are multiple realities set on top of one another. It's almost, one can think of it as a set of concentric circles, which are dimensions or portals that coexist. And, but if you think about, how quantum mechanics actually, for me, and, take this or leave it, but for me, it just re-evokes that. And in a way, sometimes this sort of perceived dissonance between science and the metaphysical or the esoteric is a false binary. I'm interested in that space in between and how we activate it, because I think for me, there's so much potential in that space. So, and I often think about how to make a work operate on multiple planes simultaneously. So, for example, I'm really pleased if somebody just enjoys the sheer playfulness of this. But equally, if they want to stop and lose their bearings or the literal ground beneath their feet and go down a rabbit hole with me into a kind of whole questioning of being and time, fantastic. How do you make a work that can speak to people on all those, that can speak to people on whatever way they want to interact or interface with your work simultaneously? And again, that's like quantum mechanics as a form of daily practice.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, some of the work that you've done in this relationship to having things be speculative, right? Because, and this is what I wanted to sort of draw out, and maybe we'll start going into the AR component here in a moment. To be able to think speculatively, right? To be able to, is to ask yourself to think open-endedly. And it's, in the making of things, I feel like there's an attempt to get to a conclusion, right? And of course, you have to actually eventually have something that you can like haul up and have there be floating in the space. But that challenge of being able to produce something that is something that people can engage with, but that isn't, I don't know if the word complete, but it isn't completed. Like it gets to continue to be completed by audiences, right? And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is, how do you check yourself to make sure you don't overburden or like over prescribe, right? So that there is that open-endedness, that openness for other people.
I mean, I think that comes with experience, I hate to bring it back to that, but it's just, sure. I think as a more, I mean, not that I don't have my insecurities today, but as a more insecure, younger artist, I maybe felt the need to over prescribe the experience or the narration or even how people should read the work, because I felt I needed to fill in all those gaps. And almost, with a bit of age, I hope a little bit of wisdom, there's more of an ability to kind of not know, to kind of actually, it's not that you remove insecurity, but you have a different relationship with it.
Yeah. And I guess I wanted to, sort of bring up, I feel like there's these other components of this work, like these sort of soundscapes that got, actually, how involved were you in those? And then there's the AR component, like these other elements that I feel like also then complicate the ability to hold fast.
I mean, for me, it's also about giving people agency. You know what I mean? Especially communities that might be marginalized, not feel represented. How do you bring them to the table and say, this is for you, this is for all of us? I mean, for me, it's a number of glass ceilings to be doing a work on this scale, this public. So there was certainly a moment when this thing started being hoisted up into the air where my 14-year-old self was going, holy shit, they let me do this? They let me, this kid of immigrant parents, kind of put a giant spaceship playing with Victoriana on my own terms into space.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is something you've come back to frequently in, in the writing and in the conversations, is sort of, you have this multinational sort of hybrid context and background. And obviously that enables a kind of, a flexibility in terms of how you're looking at things and how you're thinking about things. But there must also be things that you do as an artist, right? Like, besides pulling from that internal experience, like, are there things that you do as an artist in the studio or as a person that force you to keep that open, to keep that flexibility?
Well, I suppose it's a lot of things that kind of keep you doing that. It's about being open. I think collaboration is a huge part of that, about realizing you do not have all the answers, that inviting, so you were talking about the soundscapes. And one of the interesting things for me was thinking about, in a gentle way, pushing back against some of the direction of travel of politics in this country. So thinking about, okay, St. Pancras Station is a major icon of the city of London, but actually it goes out there's an East Coast main line that goes out to various cities around the country. There's the Eurostar, which heads out to Europe. It's this idea of how do you open up the conversation? So, for example, with the soundscapes, and for example, Nottingham is a great city, which is on the East Coast main line. And, we worked with New Art Exchange in Nottingham, who I've worked with before, but we worked with them on the whole engagement program around the work. So they brought to the table the Wonderland Collective, which is a really amazing, diverse, all-female collective from Nottingham who work across sound, poetry, design, and they created a whole set of podcasts around the work. And this was interesting for me because it's another way the spaceship could travel. So basically, you can take a train journey and listen to a podcast. And we worked on the podcast so they would accompany you on those journeys. And, I gave them a bunch of notes, clues, we spoke, but I also didn't want to kind of stand behind, and over their backs kind of saying, agency has to be freely given, to be freely enjoyed. And, they produced the most amazing set of podcasts exploring, everything from the post-human to fictional journeys to female solidarity and empowerment. And, what a wonderful way for a bored commuter coming in on their train to go, I'm just going to zone out into one of these soundscapes and see where it takes me.
So here we have one of the, there's this AR component, which is another sort of element of this project. How do people know to kind of access it? Like, are there, speaking of giving people agency, right?
So there's QR codes around the station, but you can also access it from St. Pancras International's Instagram account. If you hit the sort of Spark AR filter, any of you can do it in your front room right now.
And I've done it and it's super fun.
Yeah, it's super fun, and we basically, one of the Wonderland Collective, Jaya had a dream. I mean, she's credited there. She's a really interesting grime artist from Nottingham, and we all just in the studio loved her work. So we actually managed to get the commissioners to commission her to produce a new track and actually give her the funds to kind of produce it at a quality level that it would be useful to her to take forward in terms of her own career. And then we took an element of this new track, and that's what's the sort of looping score when you do the AR. So it's like, how do you bring people into the conversation? How do you make it go beyond just you and be about extending agency, whether in the real world or in the virtual space? And it was also, one of the things we thought about is, going back to the AR and how it connects to the physical artwork, was how do we make this ship fly?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really important part of it, right? It's this moment when you get to see it, move, right? And it actually, but one of the things I sort of love about AR is the way it really is this hybrid element, right? It's more of that thing that's between here and there, because you are in this sort of tangible reality, and yet you're getting access to this additional component, and it really brings up all of those other sets of ideas. So did you always know there was going to be an AR component for something like this?
I think it was pretty soon after I'd kind of, I was sitting actually at the same desk I'm talking to you from now, and I was just doodling the first ideas for this crazy steampunk spaceship, just going, will anybody in their right mind go for this? And, and then it was almost 5 minutes later, it was like, oh, this should fly. If we're making this ship, it should fly. And it should, going back to the point about agency, I think, how do you give people permission to kind of, I'm very lucky, both in my professional and personal practice, I'm permanently walking through portals, maybe,
Yeah.
maybe it's what my grandmother was always worried about, that I was off in dreamland, half my life. But I just think it's there, isn't it? Even going back to Alice Liddell, she's a multidimensional being like all of us are. And how do I give permission to every person walking through St. Pancras to breathe out and go, I'm not this, I'm this, taking it for a walk, also, again, I'm from London. I love the kind of layers and histories of London, not uncritically. So, for example, in the AR, the ship does a loop-the-loop inside the glass cube. So there's a nice reference to Through the Looking Glass, and that idea that, what we're looking at in the mirror is always so much more than we might think it is. Mm-hmm. And then there's little nods. You can just about see the mushrooms there. There's actually, just out of shot, there's our own take on the caterpillar, the smoking caterpillar. We had to come up with our own one to not get into any infringement with Disney. And to the right, you can just about see, a smokestack, like one of the old chimneys. And I was thinking of William Blake's Dark Satanic Mills, which is so much a part of the former history of this area, and its other shadowy, seedy kind of life, which, I lived through, not the 18th and 19th century, except in my imagination, but, even in the end of the 20th century, this area was still full of prostitution and drugs. And there were a number of like semi-legal kind of rave clubs in the back in the old goods yards. So it's gone, like any city, it goes through change, it goes through shifts, it goes through parallel realities that almost get literally layered one on top of another. And I've always been really fascinated by this idea that London sits, there's 10 layers of the city of London, from the Roman city to the present. And they're both literal layers of sediment, and they are metaphorical layers of story, narrative, conquest, change, migration. And it's like, how do you just, gently point to that? How do you invite people go on that journey, to think beyond maybe the bounds of their daily commute, their daily, journey to work.
It's also interesting because you're reminding me of that thing that everybody knows about London, but somehow gets so easily forgotten now, which is it's also a river city, right? I mean, its rivers are so important to it, and all the bridges have their own sort of significance as to their own histories and why they're there and how they're there. And it's, that sort of brings in this other kind of watery element. And I'm thinking, we're going to keep talking about the HMS Alice Liddell, but I just feel like water has been such this recurring element in your work, from, there's certainly this next piece. I mean, obviously the whole Leviathan project. And I'm wondering, water is so metaphoric, right? I mean, from a pure scientific, it's like often considered one of the, elements of life, though no one really knows what the origin of life is. They're trying to figure that one out, right? But I mean, it's got this sort of emotional element to it, right? Where it's often associated with the sort of murky emotional realm. Then I always think of Solaris, speaking of speculative fiction, right? In the way in which it is this other alternative intelligence, right? It's described this oceanic form. And can you describe a little bit about how water became this place for you?
Oof, I mean, it's hard to even think about where it started for me, because, it was only after embarking on the big Leviathan cycle that I've been working on. Since about 2015, it was, elements of that body of work only started being exhibited in 2017. But, I'm often cooking stuff for a good couple of years. It's just how I roll. But, it was only then, looking back, I could see that I'd already made 2 prequels to Leviathan without knowing it. So, there's a film I made in 2015 called It Was a Time That Was a Time, which was a collab with Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, and imagined, and it was made just not long after Hurricane Sandy. And I worked with a whole, working group of people who'd been impacted by Sandy to think about collectively, what if a bigger flood disaster hit New York State? And, we basically did this, I love crazy exercises in speculative realities. So there was like 12 of us. It was an unintentional set of apostles. And we kind of experimented with form and choreography. And we decided to embody a community which might be the last or one of the only communities still existing in New York State. And we literally we set all these terms for the project, and then we embodied them. It went a bit nuts in a good way. And
wait, what do you mean by that? You embodied them? Like how? Like what was a term that you would embody?
So in a sense, the whole plan was there was a commission from Pioneer Works to make a film. Mm-hmm. But we kind of went a bit off script and decided to live as that community rather than to do a set of performances that we filmed or were kind of geared for camera. And so even the methodology of that film became about filming with hardware that would have survived a flood disaster. So we worked on Super 8 because you could still wash the film. Mm-hmm. And we worked with really first gen digital cameras that used kind of early batteries that could work with a kind of seawater hookup.
Wow.
And then we kind of just went mad for a number of days. And, we had an amazing working group that combined, costume designers, choreographers, artists, and people from the Red Hook Collective who worked in the projects kind of after Sandy, helping people get back on the grid. And we just decided to go into it. And we kind of almost lived as this community for a number of days and documented ourselves. Wow. in this sort of past future state, and it's a very interesting, quirky short film, but it's, interestingly, some of my other films get a lot more profile and go out there, but it's still one of my favorites because it That's what I mean by embodied. It became something. It wasn't a document of something. It was a thing.
Right. And it's interesting because I mean, I that storm, I mean, from potentially several of our, audience today, remember it and its impact, but it is often these storms, right, where there's a break in the ease of life that call upon a certain type of activity that can feel quite ancient, right? Can feel like, going back to root, like, community, and yet also sort of feels slightly futuristic because of the way we've associated sort of post-apocalypse with a future. And yet it's a present moment for those people who are living through it. And so I'm just wondering, like, you gave that as an example in terms of like how water came to speak to you as this sort of topic and this reference. Do you think it was partly because it was this murky middle place that you wound up embodying, as you say? And is that something you were trying to carry into some of these other projects by invoking water?
I think, and it's hard to say at what point, because what I know now, I didn't know then.
Yeah.
But, and I think that's a really important way to make work. If you know what you're trying to get to, it's what's the point? You're not going, what you were saying earlier about an open space.
Mm-hmm.
An open space is one where you're stepping out of your comfort zone and creating something and you don't quite know the outcome. And then it's generous to the audience. So I think there's, looking back, there's definitely something about the primacy of water. There's even that sort of basic misnomer that this planet is called Earth,
Absolutely.
And, there's a whole body of work I've done called anthropopangaea, almost sort of collapsing anthropophagia, thinking about it from like, Viveros de Castro and other people's, recategorization of cannibalism as a kind of anthropological way to kind of think of how we as humans operate. Mm-hmm. And then Pangea as the sort of proto-continent, when it's one supercontinent. And, I've done these sort of large textile and painted maps called, in this Anthropopangea series where I address, because map making is something that's interesting for me. I think also as somebody from India, Pakistan, there's that huge rupture that's instituted from a sort of colonial power as it's exiting that just actually continues to breed violence.
Right.
And so I was thinking about the map, what is it that causes the map to break up, the land to break up? Are we not suitable custodians? But I went back in this map of, Anthropopangea, and obviously the landmass is in the center. And then I actually divide up the sea into territories. Because I think, it's this, how do we start to address the unseen? I mean, that's how I think of the sea. It's everything that we like to push under, So it becomes this huge allegory of everything we don't want to address.
Well, and I mean, it's such an issue with, the climate crisis and climate concerns. We talk about what's happening to the earth and species and to the air, and how often we forget to talk about, what's been happening to the water for so long. Now it's becoming a part of the conversation because it's gotten so bad. But it just thinking about, what you were saying about maps, it's sort of interesting. It recalled for me this, the sort of Baudrillard notion of the map precedes the territory, and that way in which these maps then become how you see, right? And so how can you see it without the preset map? And the work involved in doing that it seems to me regularly like what the speculative type of work is. I'm realizing we have to talk about your research because your research practice is enormous, and you've even admitted you take years sometimes before you actually, have something that you can say like, no, I really was working on something. So I'm wondering if maybe, maybe we can go to one of the other images and, just sort of talk about, does the idea come and then you start to research? Are you researching and then the idea starts to bubble forth? Are there areas of research that you find yourself consistently drawn to?
Well, the oceans has become almost something of an obsession. I think there's something in that idea of origins and what is unseen. It's that I think it's almost our ability to ignore the oceans is almost such a tell for our almost the hubristic kind of drive that's led to this sort of Anthropocene. And this is well done. I think Raven, thanks for pulling this up. The Coral Alchemy project is one I'd been wanting to do for a number of years, and so often there's a mixture of kind of responding to site and then sometimes an idea I have that just needs to get out there. And with the coral, I'm often stepping out of not just my comfort zones in terms of knowing where the practice is going, but even in terms of the interdisciplinary research that goes behind it. And I find it such an intense, source of inspiration to kind of step across and speak to people. So, my work with coral has really owes a lot to Professor Madeleine Van Oppen. She works with the Australian government on the Great Barrier Reef project, and we've had various in conversations over the years. And she's been so generous. I mean, we were introduced by mutual friends, and she's been sharing her research with me for years. And well before she ended up in Time magazine in 2019. And we have quite a it's funny because it takes a while to get comfortable with somebody from another discipline, because you actually, thinking about fragmentation, polarization, I think even within disciplines, we speak different languages. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like trying to brush up on your French to kind of have that conversation with somebody who is, she does this amazing work with coral hybridization, and I sometimes jokingly, I don't know, she seems to take it well, but maybe she's deeply resentful, I don't know, but I jokingly sometimes call her the Dr. Moreau of coral, because, she is hybridizing, it's what she calls accelerated evolution. So she hybridizes species in 5 years that would in nature take 1,000 years. And obviously it's controversial research, but as she says, there will be no coral reefs in 50 years if we do not do something. And I think, there's a lot spoken about coral reefs and the need and their importance for biodiversity, but I think we don't understand how much reef ecosystems act as a barrier against, extreme weather events such as tsunamis or hurricanes. So, coral for me this project was quite amazing because I wanted to bring coral above the surface. And this idea as well, I think, to remind us of our very short timescale on this planet, that actually this location, the carvings in the rock behind my work, they're all caused by water over hundreds of millions of years. And this location was what would have been the delta of the Red Sea 11 million years ago. And, the Coral Alchemy project was working with marine biologists and geologists to identify locations and species of coral that are under stress impact. And the sculptures recreate a sort of giant sized version, so you cannot avoid it. You're forced into a kind of dialogue and a visceral presence of these objects, and they are treated with, like the polychrome. I'm often experimenting with really complex paint surfaces or techniques, and we worked on thermochromic paint. So, if you think about those novelty mugs where you put in your hot water and they change color, it's a similar principle, just on a bigger scale. And basically these works, they actually start almost a sort of carbon black early in the morning or late at night, and through the ambient temperature they transform through the heating up of the day. So they move through the natural underwater fluorescence that the coral would present. And at the high point of heat in the day, they're entirely bleached. So, you know, in a way, it's creating in a diurnal cycle the reality of Anthropocene impacts on coral reef ecosystems. So it's like, how do you go boom, you know, where people cannot put that away? How do you, you know, how do you make that? How do you, you know, sometimes it's like, how do you evoke empathy? Because I think as you, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but it's also a really interesting thing because that's a really slow process, right? Like someone isn't going to stand there for 5 minutes, you know. Imagine someone actually looks at a work of art for an entire 5 minutes. That would be astounding, right? And they're still not going to see that, right? It's this matter of really having to look at it, go away perhaps, come back again, right? It's this kind of to go and to return. It's that wave-like motion that is, I think, what I wanted to sort of add to what you were saying is what cultivates empathy, because to return to something is to give it your thoughts, to give it your interest, to give it something as opposed to simply be receiving something, if that makes sense.
It's all, I mean, it's the true meaning of reflection, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's actually slowing down long enough to think about your part. So it's, you know, how do you wed agency and responsibility, you know, without beating people over the head with it, but invite them into a space of sharing?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because if we go to the virtual becoming the sort of squid person just for a moment, I'm becoming a virtual octopi. It's interesting because this one is it's a much more explicit statement in some ways. But it speaks to this kind of what you were talking about, the way she's sort of trying to co-create with nature under dire circumstances, right? And if I understand, like this was this moment when you were sort of exploring like how it is that, you know, in this kind of like post-apocalyptic context, like what are things that humans might need to adopt as abilities to be in the world that is not conducive to being the way we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, you know, and maybe it goes back to your earlier question about staying open, and I'm constantly kind of reading in dialogue, you know, it's just like, how do you constantly kind of pull the rug out from under your own feet? And, you know, I mean, the title is borrowed from Terence McKenna. You know, he wrote this piece on becoming virtual octopi, where he put forward a thesis that, you know, humanity was nearing the end of its simian evolutionary arc, and that the next phase would be a cephalopod, so squid, octopi, where, you know, and obviously they see their vision is prismatic, and obviously, you know, given that he was also a big, you know, advocate of psychedelics, you can see where that kind of connects. But also, I was really interested in this idea of a post-human. What could become of race and gender? You know, with certain octopi have a color changeability in their skin. Mm-hmm. You know, how does that become a future, you know, a future past? And, you know, I think at the time I was kind of dreaming this up, I was super obsessed with Rita Indiana's short novel, Tentacle. I don't know if people have encountered that. And, you know, that's, it's beautiful. Please read it. It's the connection between, you know, futurology, marine biology, and the contemporary art world is so beautifully evoked that it's really one of the best things I've read in the last few years. And just coming back to this, you know, it's sort of that sort of, you know, I'm often sort of trying to balance a lot of things. You know, it's quite a kind of, I almost feel like a clown a lot of the time. I'm sure my kids would agree with that. They see me as a bit of a clown, but it's like, how do you juggle poetics, science, you know, and your own crazy imagination? And I sometimes, it's funny because maybe in 2015 I was going out trying to meet scientists, almost like this slight stalker guy, kind of literally going, please, will you have a conversation with me? I'm this kind of artist from London. And, and what's so weird is in a few short years now I'm being approached by scientists or asked to speak to them the whole time. And I was asked to speak at to interview at CPH Docs, the film festival in Copenhagen. I was asked to interview one of the world's leading evolutionary geneticists, who's called Professor Eske Willerslev. And, I mean, my God, did I have to do a lot of prep for that. So, one of the things I asked, and it caused a little bit of uproar in the audience. I mean, I've always been fascinated by octopi, so that's me just being transparent. And I've always been, fascinated by what is the future of humanity? What do we become? What do we become in order to kind of adapt, survive, empathize in whole new ways that we haven't yet fully conceived? And so I just asked him, will it ever be possible for us to splice our DNA with that of an octopus and take on some of its attributes, like its ability to change color or to see in this prismatic function that McKenna describes? And, it was a packed room, and he turned around and went, it's already possible. And there was a big kind of collective gasp from the audience. And this, when I was interviewing him, it was on the back of, the designer baby in China that, the scientist disappeared very quickly from view. And, and I said, so what's, if it's already possible, would you see this ever becoming, a thing? And he turned around and he said, well, I see it very much like the arc that plastic surgery has gone through, from being developed for soldiers, hideously disfigured and scarred from the use of chemical weapons in World War I, to today when, anybody without any certification or license can give you filler on your street corner. And again, the audience let out a collective gasp, and it was this sort of, and I was just sort of like, how do we become this? Is it something that we should be frightened of? Is it something that we'll need to do just as a survival mechanism? One of the things that's been very hard with a lot of work around oceans and climate has been talking to a number of specialists. I mean, aside from having to kind of brush up on their disciplines and their research, one of the things that's been very difficult has been seeing a lot of their predictions come true much faster than they even conceived of.
Yeah.
So, but interestingly, if we jump to the VR, that's sort of the next couple of slides, and again, I'm always speaking to researchers, but, Eske, the evolutionary geneticist, had a part to play in this work. So did Professor Martin Ziegler, who's a paleoclimatologist, who I invited to speak at a symposium I did in Amsterdam in 2018. And there was another gasp from the audience because he pulled up a map, and this was, a few years before the new IPCC map of sea level rise was published earlier this year. I mean, this was in 2018. He was talking about climate change over millions of years, which also fed into coral alchemy. So it's always cross-pollinating. Everyone I meet and speak to is like, is a slap across the face to go back and rethink what I know. And
it seems as if, I mean, what's so fruitful about that in some sense, though, is, I mean, your very practice is sort of a response to what people are so anxious about, which is this division between, the arts, humanities, and sciences, right? And, C.P. Snow wrote this book 70 years ago, almost, speaking to the fact that, like, this was a danger, and there was a political danger to having the arts and sciences not communicate with one another, because these are practices that gain so much from being in dialogue with one another. And, it's interesting because clearly you have, but what I'm hearing also is that the sense you're getting that you are also contributing to them, and that the work that you're doing also helps them think in new ways. And, can you speak just a little bit about how you've seen an arts practice help some of these scientists expand or explore?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of Leviathan project I've been working on for a while now has an online platform, leviathan-cycle.com. And one of the things we did from the get-go, because it felt very important to not just borrow, but to also return. And so not everyone sadly, because we just don't have the budget, but a lot of the people I've been very fortunate to benefit from their insights, their research, their practice. We've commissioned texts from them and, attempted to work with them to make those more accessible to a wider audience. And we published them on the platform. And as the project has moved around different countries and geographies, we've been able to invite in more and more people, because I think, language is sometimes a barrier. Sometimes, we get very rooted in a cultural position which is fixed. And I think this is a collective problem.
Absolutely. I would just share with the audience that it's a fantastic resource. There's these incredible articles. They are totally accessible at different levels of interest. I would highly recommend anyone who's interested in art and science and water and environment and technology and philosophy. Like, you can find your pick of just some really great thought on that. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Interestingly, from stalking scientists now, they kind of tend to stalk me in the studio, and that's a sort of wonderful, I was asked to go and interview Esker, and he was sort of excited to talk with me and get his ideas out from, because and I think there's a sort of level of understanding, because I still somehow, with everything going on, maintain an academic and teaching career, and but it's very important to me. I mean, sometimes I'm pretty tired, but it's got to be circular, you know what I mean? And so there's a degree in which I understand the predicament of scientists trying to get their work out to a broader audience, because, often they're stuck within the closed loop of peer-reviewed journals that are read by their peers. So, interestingly now it's I didn't realize this, but now a lot of scientists say, please, can you help us? And it's interesting, because some of the people we're talking to, it's why isn't this front page news? It really is oh my God, no disrespect to the Kardashians, but it's really, the world is on fire, and I really care about what fashion brand or crypto you're promoting. I mean, it's
true. So with that in mind, you do, however, use these emergent technologies, and with VR, right, there's such an association with sort of spectacle around it, right? And I think one of the things you've done so carefully, and this is actually a sort of lovely example, is the way VR can do more than just either be some kind of global shoot 'em up game, or be this kind of, razzle dazzle. So when you use VR, what is it that you're trying to manage in how you express your practice through it?
Well, interestingly, like you were saying earlier, it's often, I don't know what's leading to what. And I like sometimes to move, even or be moved between virtual material. So for example, the octopus human hybrid sculpture, that's 2018, I think. And what you're seeing now is you as that being. Those are your tentacles. So the terrarium takes you into the future of the Baltic Sea, based on Martin Ziegler's map of sea level rise, where the Baltic Sea is much bigger than it is now, because Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands are underwater. So it becomes this much broader expanse. And then we worked with Jonas Plan, a marine biologist in Tallinn, around what the species might be that would inhabit this future Baltic, say, in 300 years. Because obviously with warming waters, different channels, and an enlargement of it as a basin, you would have a different mix. And then we took the virtual octopi into it. So interestingly, there's a sort of waiting room before you're released, but you actually are in darkened room. You're literally, you're in a black room and you are just getting used to your new body. Mm-hmm. And, it's this sort of almost, I've always been a fan of Donna Haraway, but I was like, okay, how do you give people that sense of actually becoming or being this this future post-human, hybrid? And in a way, I guess, I've always felt, a little bit like a fish out of water, but being sort of, being from having sort of so many cultures kind of influencing who I am and not feeling fully one or another. And
it's really important because, of course, it's also a part of, it's that empathy you were talking about, and then it's about that being kin, and having a kind of respect for and appreciation for other ways of living, of being. It's interesting though, because, one of the challenges of your work, and maybe we'll sort of, I'll try and wrap it up around this, is that, you start to push us into recognizing that this way of being, this human way of being, quite literally beyond the socio-political being untenable, might not be able to be physiologically tenable, and might require that we rethink why we're so attached to having this be the only or best way of life. Have you started to think about, like, do you find yourself challenged thinking about that?
Yes, all the time. Particularly this, through this kind of Leviathan process. I mean, it's not like I haven't thought about it for a long time from my own sort of spiritual practice, but I think, going out into the world and literally being buffeted around by bodies of research that blow my mind, serially, it's like, it's just a constant wake up call to, there's a really interesting Aldous Huxley book called Island, which is sort of quite a satirical play on utopias, on theosophy and other kind of esoteric tendencies, in the maybe the first half of the 20th century. But basically on this remote utopian society, all the parrots in the trees have been trained to literally say, wake up. And it's interesting, it's to force people into this sort of, to be awake again to your body, to be sensitive to your environment. And obviously this sort of, a capitalist industrialist arrives on the island and finds these parrots incredibly irritating. And it's like, where do we choose to sit? You know what I mean? It's, it goes back to St. Pancras. It's like, how many people are just going straight past, not noticing this thing overhead because they're rushing to work, to pick up their kids. And, I get it. We all have those daily responsibilities, the need to pay our bills and do our thing. But, it's been wonderful just in the short week it's been up to just see a couple of people stop. And then it almost start to spread. You know what I mean? Because a couple of people are looking up, and then other people rushing past stop to look at the people looking up, start looking up, other people crash into the back of them, start looking up, and
that's the thing about attention, it's viral.
It's viral, and I think, maybe it's not the worst thing as an artist to be an irritating parrot.
Well, that was so good. I think I have to let you end on that line. But I know that we've been getting a ton of questions in the chat. So I will now step back and let some of the other people get to ask you questions, because there's more squawking for you to do as an irritating parrot.
The first question I'm going to actually ask, and I wanted to know, what was the name of the octopus book that you mentioned?
It's not a whole book. It's a short. There's two, I guess I mentioned. One is Terence McKenna's article on becoming virtual octopi, and the other one was Rita Indiana's Tentacle.
Okay.
Both essential reading in my book, anyway. Okay,
great. Our next question is from Amma. and you should be able to unmute.
Hey, hello, hello. How's everybody doing? How's England?
It's okay. You know, we're I don't know how many governments we've had in as many years, but you know, we're London endures.
That's good. That's great. You know, I had a question about you brought up the Satanic Mills, and so I was thinking about William Blake and Jerusalem, which is where that particular image comes from. And I was, you know, you're doing some taxidermy and you're kind of playing with augmented reality. And I was just wondering, you know, if the mills were, you know, like factories, you know, if that was the metaphor, you know, for the Industrial Revolution, or perhaps you were talking about something more spiritual, like, you know, churches being, you know, evil institutions. Some Blake scholars have that interpretation. You know, so how does religion play into this work that you're doing?
I mean, oof, there's a whole set of ways I could answer that. You know, I remember one of the, you know, for me, as a kid in school in this country, I was forced to sing hymns a lot. And a lot of them were terrible. I mean, just terrible in terms of their score, you know, musically very bad. But the one that kind of that would make my, you know, just give me goosebumps was Jerusalem, you know. And interestingly, many years later, sadly not where my studio is now, because I couldn't afford to have a studio there anymore, but my studio used to be near Old Street in Shoreditch in London. And it was literally round the corner from a place called Bunhill Fields, which, interestingly, how language changes over time, but it was originally Bonehill Fields. And it was basically the nonconformists' graveyard. So in literally, like, you know, 100 yards from each other, you've got Daniel Defoe, John Bunyan, and William Blake, all buried there. And it used to be where I would go on a nice morning or afternoon and sit with a book on a bench and kind of just, you know, share that space. So I think, you know, William Blake, in terms of, you know, as a young immigrant kid, you know, who faced a lot of, you know, racism and other issues, you know, it might seem like an unusual place to take refuge, but, you know, singing Jerusalem and wondering why this of all the hymns was the one that kind of made an impression on me led me deeper into Blake and understanding his sort of radical nonconformity, you know, and these people were buried there because they weren't allowed to be buried in, you know, in a sanctified churchyard because they were considered too radical. And, you know, it gave me a sense that, you know, I think no matter how successful my practice becomes, it's always about speaking, you know, there's always about speaking critically. It's always about kind of embodying what needs to be said at a particular moment, however difficult that might be. Oh, I've lost the sound. Oh, Amma, you're muted, I think.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, got you.
Yeah, I guess, you know, Blake died in poverty and obscurity, and so you were above the potter's field, is what you're saying.
You know, I think, you know, for me, it goes back to even what I was saying about communing with ghosts. You know, London is so full of ghosts that I think it's full of stories and it's full of possibilities. So I like that idea of it being a space for reinvention. You know, it's my city and I fought for it to be my city. And Blake was one of the agents who helped me do that.
Thank you, Amma, for your question. And thanks, Shezad. Our next question is from GE, and you should be able to unmute.
Thank you so very much. I am going everywhere with this discussion today and so enlightened by it. Thank you. The question was, is there a connect between the realities made, the virtual, this physical vessel that you've created, the various constructed sonicscapes that are part of it all, and of course then it brings me to the sort of Eastern concept of moving through the bardo. Is all this kind of an index for the in between death and rebirth?
I think if I answered that, I'd give away the secret to existence. But we didn't get around to an image of the first virtual reality I ever made called Kalimpong. I don't know if we're able to share that, Raven.
We have the image.
Okay.
If it's possible, it's the last one in the carousel. But I'll keep talking while you bring it up. But Kalimpong is a small town in the Indian Himalayas near the border with Tibet, and for me, I first came across Kalimpong as a teenager reading the diaries of Alexandra David Neal, the Franco-Belgian explorer who was the first Western woman to enter Tibet in 300 years. And she mentions meeting various sorcerer monks in the caves above Kalimpong. And then I came back to Kalimpong. Weirdly, it just popped out again in my 30s when I was researching. I don't know if anybody knows of the very eccentric oil, then millionaire, when millionaire was a big deal, Tom Slick. And imagine being an oil millionaire and being called Tom Slick. But he was he was a cryptozoologist before cryptozoology was even named. Also, interestingly, one of the first collectors of Indian modernist art. And he funded various expeditions to find the Yeti in the mountain ranges above Kalimpong. The third expedition often being rumored as the cover-up for the CIA operation to exfiltrate the Dalai Lama from then occupied Lhasa. So, Kalimpong for me became this vector of so many stories and mysteries and rabbit holes just to go back, since a few questions have been asked about virtuality, in the 90s, I was already interested in VR, but sadly it didn't really live up to, I think, a lot of our expectations. So coming back to it, I was very tentative. And it was a friend of mine who got one of the tech companies to give me a VR headset 3 years before they became available. And so this work was 2016, but I basically had a headset in the studio for 3 years at that point. Which I kind of need, as has already been talked about. I take my time, but I was just trying to break it, and I was like, "Do I want to use this? Is it a gimmick? Is it, is it worth kind of getting invested in?" And then literally, it was Kalimpong just presented itself as the vector to kind of do what I thought would be. I'm often thinking, maybe this is a bit dismissive, but I don't really think about the medium. I think about the idea, and then the idea actually tells me what it needs to become. And sorry, this is a hugely long answer, isn't it? You asked a more straightforward question.
No, this goes for it. Thank you. Please go.
But basically, this whole VR experience, I mean, it's epic. It's huge and sprawling and expansive, and people got lost in it. I mean, it was crazy. I put it out in a gallery in 2016, and I was just like, is anybody going to come and see this? and it went totally nuts. There were literally people calling me in the gallery all day long because the slots to book into it were totally sold out. And I was just like, what have I done? But one of the things I did to try and think about, there'd only been 1 or 2 VR artworks I'd seen at that time, and I felt somehow they were a bit cold. And I was interested in, obviously you need, for a VR, you need an invigilator. A, so you don't get tangled up in the cables, and B, just to turn it on and off, and should someone get dizzy, to help them out. And I was like, well, isn't that underusing? If you've got a person in there. And so basically, I trained everyone up to be virtual tour guides to Kalimpong. And they would say hello to you. They would welcome you on your journey, and they would accompany you on your journey. And, they would, we work with them on empathy to feel what somebody was feeling, and to kind of give them more information if they needed, or let them roam if they needed it. But basically, Kalimpong took you through 6 locations. You know, you literally you started in the Himalayan Hotel, which is where Alexandra David Neal stayed when it was the home of the family of the former British, trade representative in Tibet. And then you went through the mountain pass. If you were lucky, you encountered the Yeti. There were a lot of glitches we built in. So interesting, when everyone else was trying to make VR seamless, and I never understood that, I can go out my door and it's seamless. It's pretty damn good. I'm not going to compete with that. So actually the glitch became very interesting to me. And even thinking of like a history of analog film versus new media art, when a lot of the analog film artists were critiquing the new media artists for glitchiness and whatever, they took that as a badge of pride and kind of lent into it. So I was like, the glitch. And the Yeti is a glitch, isn't it? It's a glitch in the imaginary. That started to become philosophically interesting, where the glitch becomes a philosophical rupture in our daily life. And basically, coming around to actually finally answering your question adequately, these 6 stages were obviously the Bardo. Because it's all the Bardo, isn't it? And that's about waking up, isn't it? Whether we're talking about oceans, mountain ranges, Yetis, spaceships, it's all about me being an irritating parrot.
So wonderful. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, GE, and your answers, Shezad. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Ty Liddell, to the stage. Poet Ty Liddell's work has been featured in We Want It All, an anthology of radical trans poetics, Shit Wonder, and elsewhere. Her debut chapbook, Zero, will be released by Ursus Americanus Press in 2023. She is currently an MFA candidate in the Milton Avery Graduate Program and of the Arts at Bard College. Welcome, Ty.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was so exciting as someone who studied religion in undergrad. So I'm going to read a few things. And yeah, I'm going to start with a poem that kind of evokes the Paleolithic. So I'm excited that that was brought up, and they're grotesque a bit. So this poem is called Sinopia. Some strange interior, a natural void, as if anything living with form were without depth. Breath weathered and eroding through a socket. An indigenous monument to gaze at through a verb, ensouling. Sharp maroon frescoes painted some myth scene in the portico. Speleothem spelled out what was to come, a breathful eddy, language, phlegm, paint flaking off, fleeting, or Eileen said, when I learned the word interiority, it was like they motion with their hands, making the invisible visible. Language in motion, I am projecting myself in. I'm in the poem and it is dark. There are bison and many-headed hydra which trample me. I'm impaled on a nipple of stone. I vomit ancient dust, shit coils of bones, all flayed and shaped into a snake with the head of my father and his father whose cheeks were oily boils, his legs removed from too much ice cream. My excrement opens and excavates me, sloughs its way off of the crack, the body's fissure cut in two, like my twin who lies inside me, looking in, one of shadow, Massa confusa, like Medusa, who follows her son in her nightmare gait. Hand images, bison images, dancing birds on sticks in the fatty wax, plump breasts of stone. The poet is suckling the guano paste and spitting it out into the voided wasteland of invisible brown in the black in utero matrix. Superimposed forever like a gash that incessantly heals, hand plunged in dilation of my myth body geography. The life of the intertextual body, situates itself on a plane of images, a referent of itself, a parade of eyes like the architecture of a graph, where language gleams like the vulval lips of a collective family figure sewn together and split into a whole, human or earth. The wound swallowed them all up, a haunted, fist-fucked phenomenology torn at the seams. And the next poems, the next two poems are like from a series of erasure poems from a genealogy book passed down to me. And the first one is called Historical Spirit 1. The study of one's own, arduously tracing down, sorting them, fitting them together, never completed. Always open areas, miscellaneous pieces which do not fit into strange bypaths, unexpected ways. Unknown relative out of stranger. To me, this is lamentable, insignificant. It is a part. It is passing. The writer acquired another probably unrelated branch. Data was derived from parts. I has been found from the form without origin, an impossible person having no ending. We froze and went. And the next poem is Historical Spirit 4. Doubt would carry on the name. Time was a widow. This name came from that between one had to cross, a name given, derived, many. Language signifies language, meaning marked. And the last bit of reading are just kind of poem fragments from my notebook that I've just been collecting. So, yeah. Here is the poem. Event, time, residue, memory, interpretation, language. Outside of the studio window, there is lamppost, green, cloud. All that can occur there cannot occur here. I will never see myself in the field. Bought a vis-a-vis and vice versa at the art store in Rhinebeck. Language is the process, the lived life, the cost and labor. No life is free from material. In the dream, he was inside the chitinous architecture of the insect attic. There's a wall made of insects in the head of the house, which transfigures itself as one enters, roils its carapace and leaves hot excrement around its structure. The insect attic is a large body which processes its inhabitants. It is a processing machine with buzzing mechanics like a hissing cockroach. Is it withholding not to write? It is destructive. I had not been writing, living and speaking instead. The page ingests the life and releases it outwards. To write unencumbered by thought is to let the mind-body dichotomy falsely relate to your hand. Waking up to sit and write and fail, read you, obsessed with what your words could mean for my life. I want the poem to last forever, or as long as my life. Can't commit to a single one. Scroll through Grindr messages, reveal my love for others, desire you, want to give birth to 1,000 cockroaches and crush them. The rain is so thin, like pencil marks, infinitely trailing the entirety of a page, a blurry field. The topography of the dream is less field and more form. It is bound to our histories and bodies. Like the poem, it creates on its own. We enter the dream and trust in our unknowing. Check my phone when I wake up and erase hours of history. To document my failures is to reveal the act of non-writing as a field in itself, a real field where flowers are hollow spaces, like a painting made of cutouts without color or space. Once the form is found, all must be within it. Life equals form equals language equals field. I am in the field and I am. I strive for the persimmon tree as well, to really touch it, not to point to it or speak at it, not to describe it, but to be within it. Perhaps I must leave poetry behind, leave the body behind. Perhaps what my poetics really wishes for is a complete erasure, a death. I am searching for what is behind the image, the visionary, the phenomenal, the pursuit of the lack of abstraction, all. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ty. That was beautiful. And thank you, Shezad and Charlotte, for this amazing conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And join us. And on Tuesday at 1 p.m., look out for a newsletter in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day. On Monday, I'm sorry. And on Tuesday, we have Eric Fischel and Jason Rosenfeld on the event of Towards the End of an Astonishing Beauty in Algae to Sag Harbor and Thus America at Karst Gallery. And we conclude with a poetry reading by Joshua Edwards. And you can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ty, for finishing
Bye,
us
everyone.
so beautifully.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Shezad. Great
Thank you, everyone.
you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for the reading. Beautiful. Thank you, Shezad.
Have a great
Thank you.
weekend.
Have an amazing
Happy
weekend,
Friday, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Congratulations on the show and everything. Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah.
I'm
Thanks,
sorry
Charlotte.
for the
Bye.
whole thing, but I will
Bye.
re-listen to it super later. Have a great weekend, okay?
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Raven, for hosting, and everyone else for making it work. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.